It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello.
In the first part of today's program, we're going to talk about the state of small business in America. Research has shown that between 2007 and 2017, the number of small retailers fell by 65,000. In 2018, more businesses closed than started in the U.S. Communities across the country are losing their local retailers. Consumers are becoming more reliant on large companies, and small vendors are stuck selling on Amazon's own marketplace platform. The mainstream narrative about the decline of small businesses has been that larger corporations are more efficient, offer lower prices, and simply outcompete smaller local companies. Is that accurate? Or could it be that our government has abandoned its anti-monopoly policies, allowing large firms to amass political influence, control over the distribution systems, and the ability to starve local economies in the pursuit of ever larger profits? That's what we'll ask our first guest today, Stacy Mitchell. She is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and she testified before Congress last month about these very issues. Next up, we welcome back Jesse Eisinger, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at Publica, who's going to tell us how conservative groups are resisting efforts to raise the IRS budget. And when I say conservative, they are conservative in the sense that they want to conserve their vast fortunes. Hundreds of millions of dollars for the U.S. Treasury go uncollected every year because the IRS does not have enough resources to audit the wealthy. We look forward to talking to Jesse about all of that. Then Ralph will answer some more of your listener questions. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, we always hear politicians extol the virtues of small business. But do they really care? David?
Let's go to Portland, Maine, where Stacy Mitchell is standing by. Stacy Mitchell is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and directs its independent business initiative, which produces research and designs policy to counter concentrated corporate power and strengthen local economies. She recently gave a TED Talk on why we can't shop our way to a better economy. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Stacy Mitchell.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you.
Welcome indeed, Stacy. Let's start with the question, what do you mean by local self-reliance? It's a vast series of scenarios, as we all know, but let's take your take on what do you mean by that?
We think of local self-reliance as the idea that we should distribute more decision-making and authority and power to local communities. This notion that we are concerned that more and more people have, local communities and individual people collectively have very little authority and control over their lives and their economies and their, local policies and government. Our goal is to decentralize more of that power, to have more of the decision-making and say over economic activity and the capacity vested at the local level. And we think that's very much in keeping with democracy and with building healthy communities.
And what would you like to see ideally start happening at the local level, both in terms of selling, planting, manufacturing, and other community institutions that are often called the civil society as backup? What's your future scenario?
We see so many places that, both urban neighborhoods and small communities that are really bereft of economic wherewithal and capacity. And a lot of that is because of the incredible concentration that we've seen over the last 30 years across multiple industries, where you have, a handful of companies, whether it's Walmart, which utterly dominates the nation's food system, is the predominant grocery retailer, whether it's consolidation in manufacturing of all different kinds. All down the line, we have seen one industry after another consolidated into very few hands. And the result of that is that you've got a few places that are home to the headquarters of those big companies that are, on the one hand, doing fairly well in the sense that they have some degree of white collar, sometimes well-paying jobs, though they often have lots of poverty and lots of displacement too. So I want to be careful about that. But you have a handful of metro areas that are sucking up a lot of the wealth. And then you have vast swaths of the country that are being marginalized. And that includes both rural areas in many cases, but also sort of other cities across the country that are really, really derelict. And so my feeling is that we really need to break up those concentrations of economic power and that we need to distribute ownership and control over the economy much more broadly. And there are multiple ways of doing that. One way is to have more small and mid-sized businesses, to actually have much more diversity in terms of businesses. Unions are an important part of that solution too, in terms of having working people having a say over their jobs. And then I think there's a lot more room for various kinds of public and community owned solutions, whether that's community owned broadband, for example, which, 7 of the 10 fastest broadband networks in the country at the local level. The internet service is provided by either a public entity, a co-op, or a small provider, not one of the giants. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that. But in general, I think the overarching approach and strategy should be, how do we break up concentration of power and how do we distribute that power much more broadly?
Well, I'm sure you're more than interested in just breaking up Amazons into 10 little Amazons using the same model. Let's go necessity by necessity. What kind of food production and distribution system would come under the definition of local self-reliance? Let's start with food.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to pause here and say that we should have a diverse economy that includes some larger scale enterprises, some regional scale enterprises, and it really varies a lot by the sector. And so this is not sort of a all or nothing kind of thing where you're either at one end of the spectrum or the other. But I think it's fair to say that we have gone really far. The pendulum has swung really far in one direction, and there are lots of detrimental impacts to that. And so when I look at the food sector, I think it would be much more desirable and we would have much more benefit if we had more small scale farms and regional food producers. We had more small and regional scale slaughterhouses, processors, distributors, and that we had a lot more local and regional food retailers. And you really need to have all of those things working together because the retail piece is as important as the others. We often focus when we think about concentration in agriculture on the big agro-processors, but yeah.
Yeah, would you include food cooperatives and more backyard vegetable gardens under local self-reliance in food?
Sure, absolutely. Urban agriculture is really important. And we're heavily involved in that through our community composting program, which generates really rich resources, basically turning food waste in a community into an incredibly powerful soil amendment for local agriculture, community farming efforts. Food co-ops are important, independent grocery stores are important, and even, small local family-owned chains are important. And again, this isn't to the exclusion of having some companies that are larger than that. But I think if we didn't have policies that heavily favored those bigger companies, then we would have a lot more of the smaller scale independent and co-ops and the other kinds of ownership models, because those businesses are very competitive. It's just that they're operating in an economy where you have a handful of giants that are able to use their market power to essentially push them out of the market.
And healthcare, let's go to healthcare. Healthcare is enormously concentrated. The drug companies merged, a few giant drug companies, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, etc., Merck, and then there's now about 3 or 4 giant health insurance companies. Hospital chains are getting fewer and larger. They're buying up local cardiology practices and other doctor practices. What would local self-reliance look like in the health care and the health insurance industry? They're both separate concepts.
Yeah, we do some work in the healthcare field, and we certainly are deeply concerned about consolidation that we're seeing among providers, as you describe. Hospitals in particular is really concerning. There are communities now that just don't have hospitals nearby at all. If you need a hospital, you're going to be driving for long distances. And also places where we see hospital consolidation, where you've got this dominant provider and the fees and charges are sky high. So this is a serious problem. As you noted, we see it in the pharmaceutical sector. And we see it among independent pharmacies, which is an area we have focused a lot of attention on because is a really clear-cut example where independent local businesses are superior. I mean, there's a lot of evidence by Consumer Reports and others that locally owned pharmacies have lower prices, significantly lower prices on prescription drugs. They provide more attention and better healthcare, and they're sort of faster. I mean, there's a whole bunch of metrics in which they just are heads and tails ahead of, CVS, Walgreens, Walmart's pharmacies. They're better at what they do. And yet we are losing independent pharmacies. And in fact, there are a growing number of communities, particularly communities of color in cities and also rural areas, where there are no pharmacies of any kind, chain or local, nearby. You have to, again, drive or use mail order or something that's really inferior. And the problem there, I mean, this just is, I think, is one of the most striking examples of how our antitrust policy has gone so far off the rails. The problem is that there are these middlemen that nobody's ever heard of, but they're very powerful in the healthcare industry, in the prescription drug sector. They're called pharmacy benefit managers. And there are 3 of these companies that basically have the whole market nationally. And what these companies do is they contract with your insurer, and they decide what drugs are going to be covered and what is a pharmacist going to be reimbursed when they dispense that drug to you under your insurance plan. That's what they do. The idea was they were going to save everybody money. Well, lo and behold, all 3 of those companies own their own retail pharmacies. And the biggest one, CVS, obviously is the nation's largest pharmacy chain. So CVS controls the reimbursement rates for independent pharmacies. And you can imagine what has happened. They have slashed reimbursement rates. In a number of cases, have sent independent pharmacies these letters that say, golly, we know it's hard to be a pharmacist these days. Would you like to sell your business? And sometimes they'll then buy the business and simply shut it down, leaving that neighborhood or that community without a pharmacy, and then expect people to use CVS mail order. They also now own Aetna, a major insurance company. And under many of Aetna's plans now, the consumer can only use a CVS pharmacy. And so you're out there in a rural area with no pharmacy, and you have to use CVS's mail order because that's what CVS's insurance plan calls for. I mean, this is just a completely rigged system. And in the process, we are losing businesses that are fundamentally better at what they do, that provide important anchor points in their communities. And that's just one sliver of, just one sort of small example of what we're seeing across the economy in one place after another.
Today's news, page 1 in the business section of the New York Times, Amazon has raced past Walmart in total sales from June 30, 2020 to June 30, 2021. Amazon registered $611 billion compared to giant Walmart's $566 billion. And you've been one of the leading critics in the country on Amazon. And that's why your TED Talk intrigues me, because conventional approach here is, don't you know what Amazon's doing to Main Street? Don't you know what it's doing to the workers? Don't you know what it's doing to local economies? For heaven's sake, stop shopping Amazon. And then I see the title of your TED Talk, which was very popularly received in 2012, titled, Why We Can't Shop Our Way to a Better Economy. What do you mean by that?
We've been very much conditioned to think of ourselves as consumers and to really think about, when we encounter something we don't like about how the economy operates, we tend to go to our response as a consumer. I should buy a different brand. I should stop buying on Amazon, whatever it may be. And as consumers, we're very weak. It's very hard for us to collectively align enough of us in making those choices, in order to shift anything. And it's also worth noting that the choices are already very constrained and defined for us. And so we have limited options, and indeed, when faced with a company that has monopoly power, I mean, the very nature of a monopoly is that it limits alternatives, so it's a very weak way to approach and ineffective, right? I mean, we've had this overarching sort of consumer mindset. It really took hold, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s. And you can see, if you go back and look at, news accounts and so on, like, politicians, our elected officials started referring to us as consumers instead of citizens. And it's our citizen muscle that we have lost track of. Our citizen muscle has very much atrophied, but that's a very powerful muscle if we can find it again. That's the muscle that can restructure the online market in such a way that Amazon has its extraordinary stranglehold and grip broken and that Amazon is cut down to size and kept within constraints that do not allow it to amass and abuse extraordinary market power, and that really create the kind of online market that we should have and the kind of economy that we should have. But the only way we're going to get there is if we actually use the power that we have as citizens to change policy. We will never get there with people trying to cancel their Amazon Prime accounts or whatever it may be.
Well, you've been working with people in Congress who are contributing to a latest resurgence in antitrust interest or anti-monopoly legislative interest. What do you see there? And who are your allies? Are your allies the Small Business Administration? Are your allies the National Federation of Independent Business? Are your allies the people who are trying to protect hundreds of thousands of franchisees in these chains like McDonald's all over the country? Who are your allies?
Yeah, my organization works a lot with independent small business groups. We helped co-found a coalition called Small Business Rising. That's a network of both local and national small business organizations. It includes trade groups like the American Booksellers Association, which is independent bookstores, and North American Hardware and Paint Association, which is all the independent hardware stores and paint stores. And then it includes local organizations like Local First Arizona, which is a statewide network of about 4,000 independent businesses. There are a number of those around the country. And those, what we have found in the work, I run our independent business program, and what we have found over the years is that we are losing independent small businesses. The decline is just steep and really shocking, and that has lots of consequences, and that the reason for it is not that these businesses can't compete and be successful, not that they're not popular, but in most cases they are facing corporations that in one way or another have strangled the market, have cornered the market, are able to muscle them out of the market or otherwise raise their costs or impede them in various ways, or simply use their political power to get subsidies and tax breaks and so on that small businesses can't get. And independent business owners experience this, but they don't always know how that connects to policy. And so we've been trying to help bring together this coalition and businesses across the country to really become engaged. There's an incredible opportunity in Congress right now to pass legislation that would break up and regulate the tech giants, including Amazon. And I think that legislation's extremely important, and I think there's a real chance to pass it.
There's a lot of people don't really know one very important power of Amazon, because it reaches so many people. It's invited a lot of small businesses to get on their platform and sell their products, under which Amazon gets a huge commission, competes against them, and cuffs them around with fine print contracts. And you have almost half of Amazon's so-called sales come from all of these businesses that are incarcerated, in effect, on Amazon platform, which is a target, as you know, of the antitrust advocates, anti-monopoly advocates, break up Amazon advocates in Congress and elsewhere. Can you tell our listeners how this works? And it's almost like an irresistible impulse to be imprisoned by hundreds of thousands of small businesses because they have no alternative way to expand their reach to potential customers.
That's absolutely right. One of the really essential ways to understand what Jeff Bezos has created, what he has set out to do. We often sort of mistakenly think of Amazon as a retailer, but really Amazon is an infrastructure company. Amazon has set out to be the infrastructure for the entire economy, to provide the rails, if you will, that other businesses have to ride in order to get to the market. They do that through their cloud services division, which has a huge number of companies and government agencies that now rely on that infrastructure to run their operations. And they do that through the ownership of their online marketplace. 2/3 of Americans, when they want to buy something online, start at Amazon. It didn't used to be that way. A number of years ago, most people would go to a search engine like Google and they would type in, running shoes or, whatever the thing is that they were looking for, and they would get a bunch of results. It would include Amazon, but it would include other retailers, including, independent local retailers in many cases. Now, because of Amazon Prime, most Americans simply start at Amazon. And if you're an independent business, that leaves you with two options, neither of which is good. You can either sell on your own site and through other platforms. You basically hang your shingle out, as it were, on these search engines where there is less and less traffic. And, it's like a dirt road. There are fewer and fewer people walking by that are even going to find you in the first place. And you're giving up 2/3 of the market right out of the gate. Or you can sell on Amazon's platform and have access, in theory, to that big part of the market. But as you noted, Amazon absolutely rules that marketplace. Amazon is taking a growing share of the revenue that sellers earn through the fees that it charges. It's now taking $1 out of every $3 that sellers earn on the site. It is Amazon pockets through the fees that it charges. And it also steals their best ideas, sees a hot selling product that they have or a new idea that they invented, copies that, and gives its own version top billing in the search results, and on and on and on. I mean, the news stories are filled with various ways in which Amazon has mistreated and abused and undermined sellers. And what we see is that most actually don't succeed. Very few sellers succeed, certainly for any period of time. Often what happens is they might have a period of success initially, and then, as they grow a bit, they sort of get caught by the algorithms, and then Amazon starts ratcheting up the fees and in other ways manipulating their business, and then they quickly fail at that point. And people sometimes say, well, isn't it killing the golden goose? Because this marketplace, all these sellers, is incredibly lucrative. It is the most lucrative part of Amazon's business, the fees that it charges on these sellers. So people say, well, isn't it killing its own golden goose? Like, what, if it's killing off all these businesses, isn't that bad for Amazon? But the trick there is that there's just an endless stream of new sellers. There are desperate Americans who are trying to figure out how to make a living, who try selling on Amazon. But then there are also a growing number of businesses that are overseas, sellers on Amazon that are based elsewhere. Now about half of what is sold by third-party sellers in the US market are sellers that are actually based overseas, and Amazon has set up a whole ocean-going distribution channel to enable that, and so on. And so there is a kind of bottomless pit of folks who come along and want to try that market. And the result is that legitimate small businesses, you just go there and lose money.
Tell people how to access the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And I take it you're mostly funded by foundations and contributions. Is that correct?
That's right. We're about 85% foundation funded, and then we have contributions from individuals, and that makes up our funding. We don't accept corporate money. And you can find ILSR, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, by going to ilsr.org. And you'll find most of our work on Amazon if you then click on the Independent Business Initiative. And then under that initiatives menu bar, you can find energy, work on some of the other topic areas that we talked about. And then if you're interested in getting involved in the fight around the big tech legislation in Congress and the antitrust movement, would also encourage you, particularly if you're a business owner or business owners, to get involved with this coalition that we've helped found called Small Business Rising, which is smallbusinessrising.net. And in terms of our funding, we are over 80% foundation funded, and the rest comes from individual donations.
Unfortunately, we're out of time here. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Stacy Mitchell, indefatigable director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, with staff out of Maine and around the country. Tell us once more how people can access.
Yeah, our website is ilsr.org.
To be continued. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
We've been speaking with Stacy Mitchell. We will link to her work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, why do we need a strong IRS? But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, August 20, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. David Sackler, one of the billionaire owners of Purdue Pharma, vowed in court this week that the Sackler family would walk away from a $4.5 billion pledge to help communities nationwide that have been devastated by the opioid epidemic unless a judge grants it immunity from all current and future civil claims associated with the company. That's according to a report in the New York Times. Absent that broad release from liability, Sackler said the family would no longer support the deal that the parties have painstakingly negotiated over 2 years to settle thousands of opioid lawsuits. We need a release that is sufficient to get our goals accomplished, and if the release fails to do that, then we will not support it, Sackler said. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Mainly people on the right wail and gnash their teeth whenever they hear the phrase defund the police. That applies to street cops, but many of those same people have no trouble taking the cops off the white-collar tax beat. They want to defund the IRS. David?
Jesse Eisinger is an award-winning senior reporter and editor at Publica. He and a colleague won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for a series of stories on the questionable Wall Street practices that helped make the financial crisis the worst since the Great Depression. He is also author of The Chicken Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jesse Eisinger.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Welcome indeed, Jesse. There's a lot to cover here. We've had programs, including John Koskinen, former IRS chief, on tax issues, and people are pretty well attuned to how the rich and powerful and the corporations both avoid and evade taxes. They avoid taxes because they help write the tax laws with the loopholes and the escape clauses, and they evade taxes because, and this is a subject today, the IRS is extremely restricted in terms of its budget. Since 2011, the Republican-dominated Congress has starved the IRS knowingly and willfully, in my opinion, in ways that expose them to the charge that the Republican Party and its right-wing groups around the country supporting the restriction of the IRS budget are aiding and abetting tax evasion. And that's where I'd like to start with you. Could you describe how the IRS is strapped, what the prospects are for expanding the budget with the Biden proposal, and the recent counterattack that was reported in the Washington Post in July 9 by so-called conservative groups, basically corporate-funded groups, to launch a major assault on any effort in Congress to expand the IRS budget?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. So my colleague Paul Keel at ProPublica and I have been covering what we call the gutting of the IRS since 2018. This is a story that really accelerated in 2010. The Republicans have been turning against the IRS since the Gingrich years in the mid-1990s. The contract with America called for cuts to the IRS budget, but this really accelerated. The recent story accelerated in 2010 when Republicans took over Congress in the Tea Party wave. Obama was president, of course, but Republicans started really cutting the budget substantially that year, and it accelerated for several reasons. One was that in negotiations to reach some kind of bipartisan budget deal, there was a freeze on all government spending, and that hit the IRS in particular. A big reason also was that Obamacare called for administration of the massive healthcare insurance program from the IRS. So the IRS was saddled with enormous amount of new responsibility. And the Republicans, as everyone knows, all the listeners will know, were adamantly opposed to Obamacare. And having been unsuccessful in the courts and unsuccessful in the legislature to repeal Obamacare or block Obamacare, they decided to block the funding of it and the administration of it by attacking the IRS budget. And then finally, there was something of a ginned up scandal that Koskinen, who you mentioned earlier, came in to be the commissioner to sort of quote unquote clean up the IRS. It was a ginned up scandal about how the IRS was supposedly targeting Tea Party groups for excessive audits. This was really a fiction, but it was a pretext, and that accelerated the IRS budget. So the result of this steady cutting of the IRS is a gutting of the agency to where it's a shadow of its former self. And I can explain a little bit about how substantial the cuts have been.
Yeah, well, we want to do that. And a subsequent review of the charges of the Republicans that the IRS was selecting unfairly conservative groups to audit showed that they were also auditing liberal groups or whatever designations they weren't engaging in political partisanship. Anybody who knows anything about the IRS knows that they're very sensitive to performing in a way that allows people to accuse them of being pro-Republican or pro-Democrat or pro-liberal or pro-conservative. When it comes to cutting the IRS budget, people know what it's about from waiting for hours to get on the phone to the IRS agents to get their questions answered. They know how long it takes to open up an online account. They know it from the consumer interface. But I would like you to talk, Jesse, about the serious decline in audits of giant corporations straddling the earth, picking tax havens, escaping this, banks and big insurance companies and manufacturing companies and so on, and how the super rich manage to park a lot of their money overseas. And if they can't avoid taxes because they've got their own loopholes through Congress, they evade them, get away with it because there just aren't the investigators, the auditors around. There's been a tremendous decline in that rich area of potential enhanced tax revenues to the U.S. Treasury so that the deficits can be reduced for our children and some of the money be used for infrastructure. So it all has a circular effect on life in America. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. The IRS budget has collapsed, and with it, there's been an exodus of IRS employees. Tens of thousands of people have left, including mainly the most talented and sophisticated auditors, the revenue agents who really understood how to audit the wealthy and large corporations. They were the ones that were most attractive in the marketplace. So the substantial brain drain and institutional knowledge that's gone out the door is understated by even the tens of thousands of employees who've left. Audits now have collapsed to 80% for the wealthy of where they were at their heights in 2010. The largest corporations in America used to be audited every single year. Now the audit rate is about 50% of the largest companies, a little bit lower. And that overstates things because the audits are thinner now. They don't cover as many topics. They're not as wide ranging. Often the IRS needs to signal what they're going to audit ahead of time, which of course gives everybody the ability to get their ducks in a row. And so now the state of affairs is so catastrophic that we have fewer auditors than at any time since World War II, when the country, of course, was less than half the size and the economy was less than a seventh of the size. And your chances of being audited now, if you are a member of the working poor, somebody who gets one of the earned income tax credits that you get as one of our most successful and wide-ranging anti-poverty programs, your chances of being audited if you are a member of the working poor now is greater than if you make $500,000 a year. So what the audits are now of disproportionately are of the working poor. 40% of what the IRS does to audit people is of the working poor. And so that's the state of affairs. The wealthy are seeing fewer and fewer audits. They're thinner, they're less aggressive, and the really aggressive audits are of the working poor today.
So we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of escaped tax payments. And of course, as the years go on, the corporate accountants and the tax lawyers begin widening their license to avoid or evade taxes. And people get bitter because they see the double standard. As you say, if you're earned income credit, you're more likely to be audited. And why then does the Biden administration, which has put forward an $80 billion 10-year increase, that's $8 billion a year, to the IRS budget, which budget is now between 12 and 13 billion, which is slightly less than the cost of an aircraft carrier, one aircraft carrier, it's running into great trouble in Congress. Why has Biden not replaced the head of the IRS, chosen for Trump purposes by Donald Trump? Why is he still in charge?
Yeah, the current commissioner is a guy named Charles Rettig, who was a private tax attorney who represented wealthy people, especially people who are getting audited. I don't really think he's part of the problem, frankly. In fact, he's been requesting, as commissioners before him, a succession of Republican and Democratic commissioners before him have been requesting, begging Congress for more money for many years now, and Reddick is no different. He says, as you just referenced, there's a tax gap of money that is owed to the government that the government is not collecting or unable to collect. And the latest estimate, which is years old, officially is $600 billion a year, but Reddick has recently said that it's probably about $1 trillion. And this is not taxes that we should raise if we raise the rates. This is stuff that's owed today that we're not collecting, including from people who make over $1 million a year and owe over $1 million in taxes and don't file their taxes, and we're still not collecting it from them. There's many people, thousands of people like that in the United States. So Reddick, I don't think the problem is. The problem here is that Republicans are still blocking any effort from the Biden administration to increase the IRS budget. Biden administration wanted to allocate an additional $80 billion over the course of, I believe, 10 years to the IRS, which would really bolster the tax collection system and the auditing, of course. This is a reclamation project that's going to take many billions and many years. So that would be a start. But the Republicans are blocking it. In part, they're blocking it because of ProPublica's series of stories that we've just launched this year on the secrets of the super wealthy, based on a vast trove of IRS data that we collected that showed that Jeff Bezos has paid zero taxes in 2 recent years and Elon Musk has paid zero in taxes. And we did an unprecedented calculation of the wealthiest tax rates compared to their growth in wealth and found that they pay 3.4% when the typical American pays about 14%.
Jesse, how can they get that report? Give the website.
Oh, so it's at ProPublica, and it's called the Secret Irs Files, and it's a series of stories we've launched this year based on unprecedented data, specific tax information data on the wealthiest Americans.
Well, the IRS director, he is changing his colors because, as you pointed out, he came from the world of corporate tax attorneys carving out this and that for his clients, and that's one reason why Trump put him in charge. But isn't it true that the original proposal to expand the IRS budget that Biden sent to Capitol Hill was incorporated in a larger infrastructure bill, and it was presumed until about a month ago that the Republicans were going to go along with expanding the budget, and then something happened and they turned against it, and the Democrats dropped it from the overall bill and put it on the shelf temporarily. Can you elucidate that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There was a burgeoning bipartisan agreement to come up with the infrastructure bill, and there were negotiations, and part of that was going to include massive amount of new funding. Well, not necessarily massive, but a substantial amount of new funding for the IRS. And then, essentially a bunch of anti-tax conservative groups woke up to this and started writing letters and lobbying against this, including Grover Norquist, but several others like the Club for Growth. And really all it took was a letter or two from these guys to say, what are you, crazy? Why are you giving the IRS more money? They're just going to have more power, and that's going to mean more audits. There wasn't a pretext of concern that the IRS couldn't be trusted with data because people are making assumptions about where the data that we obtained came from and why. I think most of those assumptions are unsafe assumptions and poorly thought out and erroneous, but we're not getting into what specifically is erroneous about them. But all they needed was a pretext. I mean, you have to understand that 40 or 50 years ago, there was a bipartisan consensus among Republicans and Democrats that we needed an adequately funded, functioning tax collection system in this country that disproportionately audited the wealthy because that's where the money is. And that bipartisan consensus has collapsed. And now Republicans are really against the IRS, against tax collection, against audits, and they kind of woke up and remembered that they were against it and drew their support for increasing the IRS budget. So the infrastructure bill looks like it's going forward without any increase to the IRS's budget.
Well, they know exactly what they're doing, and I think it's fair to say that part of what they're doing is aiding and abetting tax evasion on a massive scale. Would you agree?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that if you want the wealthy to pay their fair share, you have to do two things. You have to change the tax laws as they exist, because it's easy to avoid taxes if you're super wealthy without breaking the law, but that there are substantial law breaking estimates of substantial law breaking, and we need an enforcement mechanism to encourage people to pay their taxes. And today we do not have an enforcement mechanism. We essentially are allowing our tax collection to be lawless and unpoliced. So in that kind of environment, you have to imagine that evasion is thriving. It's very hard to say exactly who and how much, because we just don't know. It's really outside of, it's not visible to us.
As someone once said, Jesse, it's defunding the tax police so they can't go after the violators and the evaders of tax payments that are due to the U.S. government. I mean, it's like defunding the police, only it's defunding the tax police. So they don't have the auditors, they don't have the investigators, they don't have the litigators, and they've strip mined enormously the IRS from being able to do that. Imagine you're a giant corporation and you're operating in all kinds of countries, and you can shift profits here and shift costs there and defer and do all that. And you know that the chance of an audit is 1/7 or less of what it was 20 years ago. You're going to do more of it. There are no cops on the beat.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a successful defund the police, and there's a successful prison abolition movement in this country. It's for the wealthy, and it's for CEOs, it's for tech moguls and pharmaceutical executives and opioid manufacturers and the billionaire families that are behind that. And they've won. They've gotten the cops off the beat. There's no question. And that's what my book is about, The Chicken Club, about why we failed to prosecute white collar criminals. And the tax picture is another part of this. They have gutted the regulatory framework, and they've gutted the government. And now we've let loose the criminals.
Before we get to Steve and David's comments or questions, we've been talking with Jesse Eisinger. Jesse is one of the great reporters of corporate crime, fraud, and abuse in America. And his book, The Chicken Feces Club, should be read by anybody who wants to get angry enough to turn around their senators and representatives and say, get real here, start collecting $1 trillion of uncollected taxes every year so we can put it in rebuilding America and reduce the deficit on our children and grandchildren. You would think that would be a winning political argument for some of these people running for office, Jesse. Steve?
Yeah, Jesse, when conservative groups, and actually I hate to use the word conservative because it's not really a conservative principle, that they're just trying to conserve their own power. Let's say when right-wing groups or politicians are talking about money in politics, the pretext, the excuse is First Amendment. It's a First Amendment thing. For not funding the IRS, what is the pretext? What is the excuse? How do they sell this on some higher moral principle?
That's a very good question. I mean, one is that the IRS can't be trusted with more power. So there's been a narrative that the IRS has been corrupted. We were referring to the Lois Lerner scandal in the Obama years, where there was an idea that the IRS had become a weapon of the Democratic Party and the Obama administration to go after its political enemies. That's a very potent argument. There was a strain of it in the late 1990s where there were hearings, really kind of salacious and dramatic hearings with people behind anonymized screens with disguised voices because they were supposedly so afraid of the black helicopters and thuggish IRS agents who were abusing their power. So there is a notion that there is an abuse of power, an invasion of privacy that comes from the IRS. And so there's certainly that element. And then there's an idea that lower taxes provides economic growth. And that doesn't really follow that we should not enforce the tax rules that exist today, but they really haven't bothered to really articulate any underlying intellectual argument for why we shouldn't enforce the existing rules, as much as just saying that the IRS is an abusive bureaucracy and needs to be stopped.
Well, there have been instances where the IRS has abused its power over the decades, but that's to be corrected specifically. But it has nothing to do with $1 trillion of uncollected taxes. That's just the reverse. That's stripping the IRS of the ability to collect taxes, which millions of Americans pay regularly and other super rich and big corporations do not pay regularly.
I mean, there were, in the Nixon years, Nixon did have some abuses of the IRS, but post-Nixon, there have been reforms to the extent that there are only 2 political appointees at the IRS of the many tens of thousands of employees, and the political appointees don't have that much power. So it's not the kind of bureaucracy that can be weaponized, in contrast to the Department of Justice, which was really weaponized under Trump and Bill Barr especially, with a lot of political appointees and a lot of people who are willing to investigate Trump's enemies and protect his friends. And there was a deputy attorney general who almost tried to overturn the election, Jeffrey Clark. But the IRS bureaucracy has really been insulated from political abuse and weaponization since Nixon. I'm not familiar with any really substantive abuse of power scandal since then, and I don't regard the Lois Lerner purported scandal as an example of it.
David?
There's so much clarity in this conversation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I mean, there's so much clarity, and it's so frustrating because the messaging for the Democratic Party is right here in this conversation. What Ralph said, defund the police. Well, the IRS, the justice, that is the police. And I don't understand why our side, whatever our side is, can't message the way the right wing does. I guess the question I'm asking is, does this go back to the Powell memo? Did they purposely try to run on law and order and get Americans terrified of crime on the street? Is it that calculated? Get Americans terrified of crime on the street so they won't focus on, as Ralph says, crime in the corporate suite. Is it that calculated?
Well, I think these are questions that are a little bit above my pay grade about, political messaging. I'm just a reporter. We're nonpartisan. We're not policy advocates. But I would say that there was a revelation that the IRS became a nexus for administration of bureaucracy, even before Obamacare. But Obamacare was a really crystallizing moment for Republicans. And they realized, if the Democrats are going to give the IRS increasing amounts of power to administer the biggest anti-poverty program, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and Obamacare, the big government healthcare program, then if we go after the IRS, we're really going to cut things off at the source. And we don't have to cut the budget for these things. We can gut the running of these programs. We can cut the bureaucracy for the program. So it was a very smart strategy that Republicans employed. I assume that they understood the end goals of their strategy, and that the other politically astute aspect of this is that Democrats ran away from the IRS because the IRS is not particularly popular. Defending the IRS puts the Democrats in a slightly untenable position. Nobody really likes to pay taxes, and nobody likes the tax man, even if we think of it as an obligation for civil society or the price we pay for civilization. decentralization, which is the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes quote. And so the Democrats acceded to these cuts because they were put in a political position of having to defend the audits, defend the jackbooted thugs of the IRS against their depredations. And the Republicans were on the side of the average person not being done by the taxman.
The point that David made on the lack of messaging. I mean, It is amazing that the Republicans right now in Congress are not paying a political price for aiding and abetting super rich tax evaders and global corporate tax evaders. You would think the Democrats would know how to pin them against the wall on that.
The IRS would be popular if they were going after Al Capone and the way they did. And to me, Jeff Bezos is Willie Horton. If they had the courage, if Jay Carney weren't working for Jeff Bezos, the Democrats could run a campaign that portrays Jeff Bezos as more dangerous than Willie Horton. That's real messaging, Ralph, right?
Well, I mean, people who pay their taxes, the vast majority pay their full taxes. A lot of them is withheld. They don't like the idea that this super billionaires are going into space and paying no taxes. I mean, for 2 years, according to your report, Jesse, Bezos paid zero taxes. Is that right? Federal income taxes, rather?
That's correct. 2007 and 2007, he paid zero in federal income tax. And more importantly, over the course of the last 5 years, he's paid a tiny fraction of his growth and wealth in federal income taxes. So he really is outside of the tax system. So you poll that has come in at 90%, which includes a lot of conservative voters. I don't understand why the Democrats are so shy about making this a law and order, stop the tax evaders at the highest level of zillionaires and global corporations. Well, we're out of time. We've been talking with Jesse Eisinger. And Jesse, before we leave, tell us the title of your book and the website so people can really dig in. This is the greatest amount of tax information about the super rich ever made public, listeners. And you'll want to look at this website. Go ahead. Yeah, so I work for ProPublica, and it's at propublica.org, and the series is called The Secret IRS Files, and we're going to be publishing stories all year and probably into next year on the wealthy and their tax avoidance. And my book is called The Chicken Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. And it's about the decades-long collapse in white-collar enforcement in this country.
Which continued with the recent deferred prosecution agreement, a sweetheart deal that the Trump Justice Department, just before they left office in January, dealt out to the Boeing crime scene on the 737 MAXs. And it was conducted by a right-wing judge in Fort Worth, Texas, where Boeing has almost no presence, selected by the Justice Department, and by a federal prosecutor who, after she signed off on this sweetheart deal without even a monitor being appointed for the term of the non-prosecution agreement, jumped ship and went to work with Kirkland Ellis, that happened to be the corporate defense firm for Boeing corporations. So that's another major footnote to your book, The Chicken Club, Jesse, and keep up the good work. A lot of the work you do is unsung, but it's some of the most penetrating exposés of corporate crime and its influence over government law enforcers that has ever been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very flattering. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Thanks, Jesse.
We've been speaking with Jesse Eisinger. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Hey, let's do some listener questions. David?
This first one comes to us from Ryan Tamouche. Dear Ralph, I'm a Young Veterans for Peace member and a member of your Congress Club. I've been writing into my representatives, routinely utilizing your template letters. Recently, I suggested to my community of Veterans for Peace members that we do the same. I created some template letters that direct attention towards the implications of climate change by perpetual militarism. Being a new member, I've been lacking the backing. I was told by another member that you are on the board of advisors. Is this true? Why doesn't Veterans for Peace and Congress Club share this method of engaging with representatives of respective members? I feel that this would be a way of intensifying our approach to this dire situation. What are your thoughts?
Quite a few thoughts, Ryan. Very compressed communication. Number one, I'm interested to know whether the template letters are getting a response from your representatives in Congress. If they are, please send us copies. Second, I am a member of Veterans for Peace. I'm a contributor. I give them gratuitous advice from time to time, but I'm not on the advisory board of that very fine organization, Veterans for Peace. And your idea of a collaboration with the Congress Club is terrific. Members of Congress may reject letters by constituents back home, but if they're associated with people who are veterans signing the letter, maybe they'll have second thoughts. So thank you very much for that. Keep it up, but let us know what the reaction is from Congress.
Yeah, and that's a general thing for all Congress Club members is give us the feedback. Sometimes there's no feedback, let us know that, but let us know how they respond, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you for your questions. I want to thank our guests again, Stacy Mitchell and Jesse Eisinger. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap up. We're going to have a lot of good stuff there this week. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
For a copy of the day the Rats vetoed Congress, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And also check out the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, classic recipes from Lebanon and beyond. We will link to both of those at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Ralph Nader wants you to join the Congress Club. Go to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website, and in the top right margin, click on the button labeled Congress Club to get more information. We've also added a button right below that with specific instructions about what to include in your letters to Congress. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we'll welcome Paul Sabin to discuss his new book, Public Citizens. Thank you, Ralph.
A real groundbreaking book. And by the way, the Tort Museum is open partially now in the COVID era on Sunday from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. for those of you who are in the New Jersey, New York, and New England area. Go to tortmuseum.org and bring the family.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, we have a lot more conversation with Stacy Mitchell.
Mackenzie Scott just divorced Jeff Bezos, and she took away some $65 billion. She helped start the business and did a lot of the work and negotiated a contract with transportation companies and so forth. And now she's giving her money away. She's given over $6 or $7 billion to all kinds of nonprofits, community colleges all over the country just in the last year or so. What if she offered you a grant? Would you take it?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I guess I'd have to think about that. I don't know. I assume she's sort of giving money directly. She's no longer connected to the company. And so in that sense, I don't know that she's, it counts as corporate funding, but I would have to do a little research on that. What I find is fascinating and really stunning is that I believe she's actually richer now than she was a year ago before she gave away all those billions of dollars, which gives you a sense of how friendly the stock market and our policies have been to the very wealthy over the last year when so many people have suffered.
She's given away about 7 or 8 billion, and her stock in Amazon has gone up another 20, 30 billion in the same period. Steve and David, why don't you pitch in here?
Stacy, I was wondering about your testimony to Congress last month. It was, I think, July 14th. And I wanted to ask you, how was that received? Was there any follow-up? I'm sure they all were sort of nodding in agreement, but was there any concrete follow-up that would make you think that they would go against the lobbyists who pay them to be in office?
I am encouraged by what's happening in Congress. We have seen, in the case of the House Judiciary Committee did this 16-month investigation of big tech. They produced almost 500-page report that came out last fall, laid out a series of policy proposals, including breaking up these companies, that they have now introduced and passed through committee legislation to do just that. This is the first investigation of monopoly power in, I believe, almost 50 years. Congress used to do these kinds of investigations fairly regularly of different industries, different parts of the economy about monopoly. And then it's just been absolutely nothing. It's been silence over many decades. And this was, the work that was done by the House Judiciary Committee, led by David Cicilline of Rhode Island, really has kind of lit a fire, I think, around this issue in a way that's been really incredible to see. We're expecting that there's going to be legislation along those lines also introduced in the Senate, and are, cautiously hopeful. I mean, I think what is, obviously when we and our other allies and advocates were involved in, when the Judiciary Committee considered those bills and ultimately passed them in the days leading up to that, it was so hard to get anyone in those offices to even see an email, because they were just being flooded by emails and office visits from the big tech companies. I mean, so obviously the lobbying power on the other side is just overwhelming. But that said, when members of Congress hear from working people, Amazon warehouse workers, when they hear from small business owners, when they hear from, manufacturers and producers that are having to sell into these companies, when they hear from local newspapers that are being killed by Google and Facebook's outsized power, that is just making these issues really concrete. And it's a pretty powerful coalition when you start to put together small businesses and labor around an issue like this. So I'm hopeful. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm curious as to what you're up against with lawyers. Jeff Bezos wants to build the lunar lander for NASA, but they gave the contract to Elon Musk. NASA has every right to choose who's going to build our lunar lander. So Jeff Bezos is suing. He didn't get the contract, and he filed a lawsuit claiming that by giving the contract to Elon Musk, Musk will have, quote, insurmountable leverage over NASA. And he accused NASA of unfair competition.
Right.
He doesn't take no for an answer, doesn't respect the federal government. He thinks he can just either lobby or sue his way to wherever he wants to get. What are you up against with lawyers who do his bidding?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, they talk about big law, right? All the law firms that work for these companies. And, we're seeing a huge PR machine kind of ramp up, particularly around these tech bills in Congress. And it's unnerving. I mean, we're seeing, op-eds in local newspapers that are, authored by, supposed small business interests about how, taking down Amazon's power is going to be terrible for small business. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. But nevertheless, between the lawyers and the PR firms and all the rest of it, these companies have a lot of power to influence the debate. I think, also to sort of the issue that you're pointing to, it's deeply concerning the relationship between the federal government and big tech. And I'm hoping, we've started to see some ways in which the Biden administration is maybe breaking away from that. But the fact that NASA isn't building lunar lander, the fact that we've got the defense agencies and the CIA farming out their
But he didn't even take no for an answer when the Pentagon turned down Amazon's cloud service. It was like a $10 billion contract that they gave to Microsoft. Amazon appealed it. So they just don't take no for an answer. Instead of breaking up big tech, we could start by not giving them contracts.
That's absolutely right. These companies think that their goal is not only to be the underlying infrastructure and to really control large swaths of our economy, but ultimately it is to be government in a way. I mean, when you have this kind of outsized power, you begin to have corporations that operate as kind of like private regulators of our markets. They control who wins and who loses online, right? Which businesses succeed and fail, who's allowed to do what under what conditions are completely controlled by Amazon, Google, and Facebook. That's a kind of regulatory role that they've been allowed to assume. that is, is a kind of like an autocratic government. And I think that really points to one of the problems, serious problems with monopoly, and why it's directly oppositional to democracy. But then there is also the various ways in which they are insinuating themselves into government functions, and the fact that we've got government agencies that are not saying no. And it's not just at the national level, but we did a report a couple of years ago, and there's an extraordinary number of town governments, city governments, school districts, county governments that have signed on to these contracts with Amazon, where essentially Amazon is supplying all of the commercial goods that they buy, their office paper and toner cartridges and all that sort of stuff, and on terms where the public is getting ripped off because Amazon is charging inflated prices, and where Amazon is using that kind of as a kind of gatekeeper function, where they're saying, oh, sure, local businesses can still do business, can still sell to their local governments, but they have to go through our platform. And so they want to own the cloud systems, the purchasing systems. They want to be the infrastructure for government.
You've been critical of the concentration of power in the energy area, ExxonMobil and others. How would you define local self-reliance in terms of energy these days?
Yeah, we do a lot of work in the energy sector. And I think we have this incredible opportunity where, the economics of renewables, of solar power and wind, are such that is the electricity system of the future, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, just the market dynamics are going to lead us there. But the question that we face as a society and as policymakers is, will those renewable resources be controlled by monopoly utilities and other large firms? Will we have most of our renewable wind energy coming from giant wind farms in Texas that are owned by the big monopoly utilities? Or will we have a future where that renewable energy is distributed and owned by all of us? So you have farmers who have windmills on their land and have a stake in that. You have more rooftop solar, that kind of vision. And what's better about that approach is that you change who makes decisions in the energy sector, and you distribute the proceeds of producing energy much more broadly. So you begin to deal with both inequality and the problems that we're facing in terms of democracy by choosing that latter approach. But which of those pathways we take is absolutely dependent on policy. We see some states that are choosing policies that favor the big monopoly utilities, and other states that have very much gone with a more distributed ownership system where it's lots of ordinary people and small folks who have a piece of the control of producing power.
We're talking with Stacy Mitchell, the director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Stacy, do you include energy efficiency at the local level, retrofitting buildings, homes, in ways that reduce waste and undercut the sales of the waste makers, the giant energy corporations who have very little interest in efficiency because that means reduced sales?
Yeah, that's right. Efficiency is extremely important. It is often, is the cheapest source of dealing with our energy needs in most cases. And so in that sense, it comes right back to the policy. Do we have policies in place that insist on efficiency as the first option rather than building new sources of power generation? Or do we allow the utilities to have their way where, obviously they would prefer new sources of power generation, in many cases would prefer fossil fuel based generation?
Let's go to the housing. We have one listener who is extremely concerned about renters and how they're treated. And we have a new phenomena where companies like BlackRock are calling homeowners all over the country or looking for homes that are underwater and collecting them like they were shoes. They now own hundreds of thousands of homes all over the country. I mean, this is one industry that was almost inherently local. What would you do on housing policy under local self-reliance, both in terms of home ownership, apartment buildings, and renters?
Yeah, so housing is not an area that we work in, and it's not an area of deep expertise for me. But I would say that I think with housing, and this is true for many, if not all sectors of the economy, if you pull on some of those threads, you end up back at Wall Street, right? Like what is actually the underlying issue has to do with what has happened in the financial sector and the kind of consolidation that we've seen in banking, and then also the demise of community banks and the shift of more and more of our collective capital resources into the hands of Wall Street, which then directs it in ways that enrich its own power and centralize more and more wealth. to the detriment of local communities. So I think part of the housing answer, part of the answer around local business development, community enterprise development, is that we need a financial system that actually directs our capital in ways that generate real productive activity, that actually meet our needs and generate the things that we need. And I think the housing, some of what we're seeing in housing has to do with that, where you've got these, venture capital firms that are flush with money. And meanwhile, you have ordinary people in local communities that can't afford to develop affordable housing.
I take it you'll favor not only more community banks, but also credit unions and other forms of democratizing capital. Do you favor public banking on the model of the Bank of North Dakota, which has been so successful as state bank in Republican North Dakota for over 100 years? Do you favor the public banking movement?
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a lot of research on the Bank of North Dakota and have been involved some in the public bank movement. I'm a big fan of, I certainly support credit unions, but I'm also a big fan of community banks. I think a good community bank is a critical source of capital for local business. We see some credit unions able to do that, but it is really the specialty of community banks. We've lost 40% of our community banks in the last 10 years. And what's brilliant about the Bank of North Dakota is that it is kind of, you could almost say like a wholesale bank. And so its existence enables the state of North Dakota to have a very strong network of local banks. And so they both have a public bank and they have more local banks per capita than any other state by a large margin. And the analysis that we have done has shown that they have significantly more lending to small businesses, to local farms, to other kinds of community enterprise happening in the state of North Dakota because they have a banking system that is over 80% locally controlled.
That's quite a success story. Spoken like a true summa cum laude graduate with a BA in history from Macalester College in Minnesota, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Labor history.
Yes, indeed. Well, listen, I've been ripped off by community banks. I know a lot of people. They often mimic how much they charge for a bounce check, $35. They have practices that are often as bad as the big banks when it comes to small savers and depositors, which leads me to my other question. What about the quality of the economy? Not only, local self-reliance, smaller units, more located on Main Street, more accountable, more facing their own consumers instead of robot phone calls and distant access and manipulation by the giant companies. What about the quality? Have you done work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance on a different kind of quality of local economy? For instance, a better nutritional quality in terms of food, more focus on prevention in terms of community health clinics. Prevention is not very profitable for the big healthcare industry. Quality of transportation in terms of how people move around. Quality of how government regulates businesses. Have you done much on quality in contrast to decentralized quantity?
The nature of our research and work is not simply that decentralization is good in and of itself. It is good because what we see are better outcomes. We see different kinds of decisions being made when the decision-making power is vested in the hands of communities or vested at the local level. What is notable about community-based institutions, local businesses, community banks, municipally owned broadband networks, all of these kinds of models, is that generally speaking, the people who own and operate them are mission driven, that they're in business not only to make a living, but also because they care about the thing that they're doing. The reason that community broadband networks have the highest speeds at the lowest cost in the country is because they're often driven by the desire to have a community where people have access to high-speed broadband at affordable rates. Like their mission is around that. It is not simply the mission that we see with virtually every large publicly traded corporation, which is how do we go out and for the least amount of effort, extract the most amount of revenue and wealth from people and hoard it for ourselves. I mean, that is essentially the mission of large publicly traded corporations. They are not driven to do anything more really than the minimum that they have to do. And so we sort of consistently see that, with independent pharmacies, it's a business that is run by someone who's actually a healthcare provider and is got into this because they care about healthcare. Independent bookstores are often run by people who really care about books and readers. I mean, yes, they want to make a living and that sort of thing, but it is also about the thing that they're doing. And so you get different kinds of outcomes. And you also get different kinds of outcomes when the decision making is local. But it's really important to just go back and say one other thing about that, which is that, obviously with any kind of entity, you can find businesses and entities that are no good. Like there are bad actors there, and of every form that you can certainly find. And so none of this obviates the need for strong laws, strong rules, all of that. But in general, I think if you alter the structure of the economy, disperse decision-making power, you get generally better outcomes, or outcomes that are more in line with our public values. And we're not always in this uphill fight against a handful of corporations that are really operating against our interests, and that we have to fight tooth and nail to hold to account and hold in place.
Let's talk about an area of local self-reliance that doesn't involve selling. Sports has become a big business, as we all know, and people have been turned into spectators. I often have said to newspaper editors they should call the sports section spectator sports section. The idea of participatory sports, neighborhood facilities for recreational sports being kept up to date and repaired, and more of them in more neighborhoods, more unorganized sports, sandlot teams, for example, as they used to be called. And the idea is to convert away from commercial profit-driven sports that turns people into spectators and sedentary living and all the rest that goes with it in terms of health consequences, into more activity in the neighborhood. I don't know whether you've done much on this. We have a leagueoffans.org that has paid a lot of attention to this, especially the almost total reduction of physical ed in schools anymore. They are abolishing more and more physical ed classes in elementary and high schools around the country. Do you have any thoughts on that idea of conversion from a commercial operation that has a real grip on people into more local, self-reliant recreational and sports efforts involving tens of millions of people and children?
I think that's a really interesting idea, and I like it. And I appreciate generally the idea of, I think we need to do some work as a society to figure out how to have more activities, more of our day-to-day community life that is not commercially based, that exists for another reason. And I think your proposal is really interesting in that regard, and I think has a lot of merit. I confess it's somewhat at odds with my love of the MBA. And so in that sense, I think I come back to this just sort of wanting to underscore this notion of, building communities that have more local self-reliance is, not an all or nothing to the exclusion of everything else. There is definitely room for national level activity, and even in certain sectors, bigger businesses. There's certain kinds of manufacturing sectors, for example, that are only going to be done at large scale. So, I want to be careful to just say this is about sort of encouraging people to think constructively about issues of scale and ownership, and bringing those ideas to policy in ways that can achieve some of the things that I think we ought to be working towards in terms of democracy, equity, and liberty, really.
Yeah, not to mention requiring local taxpayers to pay for giant stadiums and arenas and ballparks for the sports billionaires without having a chance to vote on it in a local referendum. That's been happening all over the country, and it's just the opposite of local self-reliance.
I wanted to bring in our associate producer, Hannah Feldman, who had an experience with a pharmacy and would like to get your comments on that. If you have an extra minute, Hannah, do you want to?
Sure. Great. Hi. It was a really fascinating conversation. I recently was in California and I needed to get a prescription filled, and it's a controlled substance. And so there are a lot of extra hoops to jump through when I transfer it. And I had just the most wonderful, I always have a hard time with places like CVS or Walgreens, but this local pharmacy, Lark Drugs in Guerneville, California, I discovered they're part of the Good Neighbor Pharmacy network. I was curious if there are similar networks for local independent businesses and other industries other than pharmacies, but mostly it was such a pleasant experience.
Yeah, I hear that same thing about pharmacies and about other independent businesses, regularly. And I think it gets back to the fact that the focus of the business is on actually, doing things that people want. The focus is on anyway. But yes, to your question, there are lots of networks and co-ops, particularly in certain sectors. So in the hardware sector, you've got these co-ops that are owned by hardware stores. So you've got Ace and True Value, which are co-ops nationally owned by local hardware stores. And those enable them to buy in bulk and to operate very efficiently and to do warehousing and shared marketing and things like that. There are similar co-ops in the grocery sector. So independent grocers in many regions are part of buying groups and co-ops that provide, the distribution in the back end for their businesses. And then you see different kinds of networks like the one you're describing. And that I think is a really crucial solution. And interestingly enough, that the formation and the idea from a policy standpoint of supporting those kinds of co-ops, those wholesaler co-ops, also really got going in the 1930s at the same time that some of our anti-monopoly policies really took hold. It was kind of part of the same movement, like we need to go against concentrated power, and then we need to build up ways for independent small-scale producers, whether it's farmer-owned co-ops or independent retailer-owned co-ops or consumer co-ops, to be able to band together and get some of the benefits of scale, but do it in a way that's much more democratic.
I had no idea that Ace and True Value were co-ops that way. When I saw the branding, I kind of assumed they were franchisees. It's a really interesting, from a marketing standpoint, I would have loved to know that they were part of local independent owner co-ops.
Yeah, they're really great. I'm big fans. And in fact, franchising, I think, and Ralph is you mentioned this, and I know is deeply done a lot of work and thought about it. Franchises are really an abusive system, right? And I think if we had proper laws that prevented, Subway and McDonald's and those companies from taking advantage of these independent entrepreneurs the way that they do, and ultimately the workers who are screwed in the process too. If we had proper laws, I think franchising would really disappear, and that the way to achieve some of those kinds of benefits in a much better fashion is to have more co-ops.
Yeah, not to channel David too much, but franchises seem like pyramid schemes.
It's simply a way for a large corporation to extract profit off the hard work of a local owner who has no control. And at the same time, the corporation can distance itself from the things that they're effectively forcing that local owner to do, which is screw over employees and rob them of their wages. In a lot of cases, just literally a fraudulent system. But we don't have laws that protect against that. And so these companies get away with it. But if you had laws that actually said this system can't be fraudulent, that put in place the appropriate safeguards and parameters, I think franchising would actually disappear. I don't think it's really a viable, enterprise the way it's constructed, and that you could really achieve that through co-ops.
And now Steve asked Ralph about his take on the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Well, a lot has happened in the past week since we last convened, and a lot of it has been overseas in Afghanistan, where Ashraf Ghani, who we've spoken about very early on in our program in the series, probably 6 or 7 years ago, has now fled Afghanistan and got the situation there. Ralph, do you have any comment?
I'll start with the beginning. After 9/11, the U.S. should have had a multilateral force, which is legal under international law, to pursue the attackers and bring them to justice with other countries involved and the United Nations. Instead, we went in with full guns blazing, overturned the Taliban government that we had given an award to a few months earlier for stamping out the opium trade, and replaced it with a government of our choosing. And over the 20 years, we exhibited the ignorance of the cultural and tribal positioning and tradition of Afghanistan. It's often called the place where empires go to die. The British Empire tried, the Russian Empire tried, now the U.S. Empire tried. And we see this withdrawal. I think most people would applaud a withdrawal, but not the chaotic form that it took. It should have been planned better and stretched out for a few weeks. And remember, unlike the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, when the U.S. was helicoptering people off the roof of the embassy, the Taliban were not attacking. They were just advancing, having done a lot of prior work infiltrating these cities, and they were just advancing, and they knew better than to attack the U.S. forces there, because that would have entailed a severe counterattack. So this could have been a more peaceful, planned evacuation of Afghans who wanted to leave, obviously U.S. personnel, military, contractors, because the Taliban were not pursuing them. In fact, I think they were surprised by the suddenness of the collapse in terms of just trying to direct traffic and keep the buses moving, so to speak. The other thing is on Ashraf Ghani. I think most people misunderstood why he fled. He fled because if he stayed there, the Taliban would have had to, quote, topple the government and seize the people in the government who were constantly sidestepped by the U.S. Imagine having lengthy peace talks going back to 2011 in Qatar, Doha, with the Taliban, and under Trump and Obama, the Afghan government was not invited to the table. That's, pretty bizarre, isn't it? I mean, you're trying to have peace talks with a uprising led by the Taliban, who have no army mechanized system, no Air Force, no Navy. They're still wearing sandals with their Kalashnikovs and grenade launchers. And then they were given a lot of U.S. equipment when the collapse of the Afghan army started many months ago. And to top it off, the U.S. gave them bundles of $100 bills in order to allow passage through mountain passes for U.S. supplies and equipment. So there's a lot more to be told about how the Afghan government was sidestepped and undermined by the U.S. government. And had Ashraf Ghani not fled with his top officials, there would have been a bloodbath. And he figured that he would incur the scourge of being called a coward, but he'll have his say once he emerges back into the public sphere.
And finally, Ralph answers one more listener question.
This question is from a listener, Nina. She's actually offering a guest suggestion, and that's Nick Brana, Movement for a People's Party. One of the founders is leading the way for a political party, non-corporate funded, to be an option on the ballot. Few words from party, healthcare, student debt, ending the wars to fund our crumbling infrastructure, homelessness, many other things to make American lives better. We'd love to hear your ideas and eventually have support. We'll be writing letters to send into the mail as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I know Nick. I've had quite a few conversations with him over the last few years. He was a major organizer for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, became a little disillusioned because he wanted Bernie to go independent and challenge the Democrats. So he's starting with a number of others, as you know, a new party called the People's Party. Some people think the Green Party is the People's Party, but I guess he wants a party that can field a lot more candidates at the local level and tries to avoid some of the bickering that goes on in the Green Party. Good luck, Nick. When he organizes it more formally, months from now, we'll consider having him on the show. Thank you, Nina.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we talk to Professor Paul Sabin about the history of the public interest movement chronicled in his new book, Public Citizens. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way